It wasn't the billion-dollar fortune that defined Dermot Caldwell III. It was the crushing weight of his own boredom. He treated the world as his private theatre, and people as his unwilling actors. One Tuesday evening, in the velvet-draped heart of New York's most exclusive restaurant, he chose his next performer. A black waitress named Hebe Washington, a woman he thought was nobody. He forced her towards the grand piano as a cruel joke, a little spectacle for his vapid friends. He expected a few clumsy notes and a round of mocking laughter. He didn't know he was about to uncage a titan. The Gilded Lyre wasn't just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the gods of finance and society, a place where deals worth more than small countries were sealed over seared scallops and vintage Bordeaux. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scent of money perfume and an almost religious quiet. For the staff, it was a different kind of sanctuary, a high-stakes, high-stress tightrope walk where a single misplaced fork could mean the end of a career. Hebe Washington knew the walk better than anyone. For 40 hours a week, she was a ghost in a crisp black uniform, her movements fluid and precise, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She could balance a tray laden with crystal glasses through a throng of oblivious oligarchs without spilling a drop. She could recite the day's specials pan-seared turbot with a saffron-infused foam and micro-arugula with the conviction of a poet, even though her last meal had been a microwaved cup of noodles. But beneath the uniform, Hebe was a graveyard of broken symphonies. Her small rent-controlled apartment in the Bronx was a world away from the Gilded Lyre. It was filled with the ghosts of a different life. In the corner of the living room, shrouded in a dusty white sheet, was an old upright piano. Her mother refused to get rid of it. "It was your father's pride and joy, baby girl," she'd say, her voice thick with memory. "And it was your future. A future that had died 4 years ago on a rain-slicked highway." Hebe had been a prodigy, not just good, but breathtakingly gifted. By the age of 9, she was mastering Liszt. By 16, she had a full scholarship to Juilliard. Her hands, which now expertly polished wine glasses, had once danced across ivory keys, pulling magic from thin air. Her professor, the formidable Dr. Albrecht, had called her a once-in-a-generation talent. Her compositions were her soul laid bare, intricate tapestries of joy, sorrow, and a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Her younger brother Leo had been her biggest fan. He was the one who would sit for hours, his head resting against the piano's side as she practiced. "You're not just playing notes, Hebe," he'd say, his eyes wide with wonder. "You're telling stories. You make the piano talk." Leo was the one she wrote for. Her masterpiece, the one she'd been crafting for the Juilliard concerto competition, was called Leo's Flight. It was a piece full of soaring arpeggios and bright, hopeful melodies. She was putting the finishing touches on it the night she got the call. A drunk driver had run a red light. Leo, coming home from his part-time job, was gone. The music died with him. She dropped out of Juilliard a week later. The very sight of a piano became a source of searing pain. The keys felt like accusations. The silence in the apartment where his laughter used to be was deafening. Her scholarship was gone, and her mother's grief was a heavy blanket over the small apartment. So Hebe did what she had to do. She got a job. Then another. And finally, she landed at the Gilded Lyre, where the pay was good enough to cover the bills and her mother's medication, as long as she swallowed her pride, along with every condescending remark from the clientele. The promise she made to herself was absolute. She would never play again. The part of her that made music was buried with Leo. Tonight, the pressure in the Gilded Lyre was even higher than usual. Dermot Caldwell III was dining at table 7, the restaurant's prime real estate overlooking the small manicured garden. Caldwell wasn't just rich, he was a predator of industry, a man who bought and dismantled companies for sport. He moved with an aura of supreme, unshakable entitlement, followed by a coterie of sycophantic men and women whose laughter was always a little too loud, their smiles a little too eager. Hebe was assigned to his section. Her colleague Ben, a struggling actor who saw the world in scenes and acts, gave her a sympathetic look. Act 3, Scene 1, he whispered as she grabbed her notepad. Enter the dragon. Caldwell was every bit the monster of reputation. He clicked his fingers to get her attention. He sent back a $600 bottle of wine because he deemed it insufficiently impertinent. He spoke about her as if she weren't there. You see the problem with this country, he announced to his table, gesturing vaguely in Hebe's direction with a breadstick. No ambition. People content to just serve. It's a failure of the spirit. Hebe's jaw tightened, but her face remained a placid lake. She had mastered the art of dissociation. The man at the table wasn't talking to her. Hebe Washington, the girl who once made a piano weep. He was talking to a uniform, a ghost. The evening wore on a slow crawl of quiet humiliations. Caldwell's party grew louder and more obnoxious with every bottle of wine. The other diners, a collection of New York's elite, shot them annoyed glances, but said nothing. No one challenged Dermot Caldwell. It was during dessert that the idea, like a toxic spore, bloomed in Caldwell's wine-addled brain. His eyes fell upon the centerpiece of the restaurant, a magnificent Fazioli grand piano, its polished ebony surface gleaming under the soft lights. It was there for atmosphere, played occasionally by a professional, hired for special events. Tonight it was silent. A slow, cruel smile spread across Caldwell's face. He looked at his friends, then his gaze locked onto Hebe as she cleared away the dessert plates. I have a brilliant idea, he said, his voice carrying across the hushed restaurant. A bit of entertainment. He pointed a thick finger directly at Hebe. You, he barked. Waitress, you're going to play us a tune. A ripple of confusion went through the room. His friends chuckled, sensing the beginning of a classic Caldwell spectacle. Hebe froze the plates in her hand, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Sir, I don't play. The lie was automatic, a shield she'd used for years. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, I'm sure you can plink out a little something. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Maybe don't be shy. He pulled out a thick money clip and peeled off a $100 bill, holding it out. Here, for your trouble. The gesture was a branding iron of humiliation. It wasn't an offer, it was a price tag for her dignity. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine was usually made of steel, hurried over. Mr. Caldwell, I must insist, our staff are not here for your entertainment. Miss Washington is one of our best employees. Caldwell didn't even look at him. Henderson, your restaurant is located in a building my corporation owns. I'm currently considering a significant rent increase when your lease is up for renewal next month. Are you sure you want to insist on anything? The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Henderson's face went pale. He looked at Hebe, his eyes filled with a helpless apology, and took a step back. He had been neutered. The room was silent now. Every diner from the tech moguls to the aging socialites was watching. It was a coliseum, and Hebe was the gladiator being pushed into the sand. Go on, Caldwell sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. Play, or are you too good to entertain us? His friends snickered. One of them, a woman in a diamond necklace that could have paid Hebe's rent for a decade, filmed the scene with her phone, a smug look on her face. Hebe looked around the room. She saw pity in some eyes, amusement in others, but mostly she saw indifference. She was just part of the evening's drama, a momentary distraction. She looked at the piano. The Fazioli, a concert-grade instrument, the kind she used to dream of touching. It stood there like a polished black coffin, the coffin where she had buried her music, her brother, her soul. Her first instinct was to run, to throw the plates down, scream and flee into the night. But then she thought of her mother, of the bills, of the eviction notice that would surely follow if she caused a scene that cost Henderson his lease. And then another thought pushed through the panic, a hot, defiant anger. The image of Leo's face, not in death but in life, his voice full of wonder. "You make the piano talk, Hebe." Caldwell wanted a joke. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to watch her fail. Fine. He would get his spectacle. Her face was still a mask, but behind her eyes a fire was being lit. A fire that had been dormant for 4 long, agonizing years. She placed the plates carefully on a nearby serving station, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at Caldwell, her gaze holding his for a long, unflinching moment. Then, without a word, she turned and began the long walk to the piano. The walk was 20 yards, but it felt like a mile. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but in the dead silence of the room, every breath seemed to echo. She could feel the weight of every stare, the heat of their collective judgment. She was no longer a ghost. She was intensely, painfully visible. This was what Caldwell wanted. This was the peak of his humiliation ritual, the slow, solitary march of the victim. She reached the piano. The polished wood reflected the restaurant's chandeliers, a constellation of mocking lights. She ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface. It felt like touching a memory, with a grace that seemed utterly out of place for a mere waitress. She pulled out the piano bench and sat down. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at Caldwell. She looked only at the 88 keys stretching before her, her battlefield, her sanctuary, her home. She took a deep breath, the expensive air of the gilded lyre filling her lungs. And as she raised her hands over the keyboard, she wasn't thinking about the bills or the humiliation or the smirking faces. She was thinking of Leo, and in the silence she began to play. The first note was quiet. So quiet it was almost an apology, a single crystalline F-sharp that hung in the air like a teardrop. It was hesitant, fragile. The diners poised for a clumsy rendition of Chopsticks, leaned in, confused. Dermot Caldwell smirked, ready for the joke to land. This was it. The pathetic little plink he'd paid for. But then came a second note, and a third. A soft, melancholic melody began to unfold, a simple, haunting phrase that spoke of a deep and profound sadness. It was not the sound of an amateur. It was the sound of control of intention. Hebe's posture had transformed. She was no longer the hunched, apologetic waitress. She was upright, her shoulders back, her body one with the instrument. Her fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, now moved with an impossible certainty, barely seeming to touch the keys, yet drawing out a sound so pure it silenced the clinking of the ice in Caldwell's glass. The smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The woman filming on her phone lowered it slightly, her brow furrowed. The melody began to build. The simple, mournful opening deepened harmonies, weaving in beneath it, complex and rich with unresolved tension. It was a sound that didn't belong in the background of a restaurant. It demanded to be heard. It was the sound of a gathering storm. Hebe's left hand began to move a low, rumbling arpeggio that rolled like distant thunder, while her right hand's melody climbed higher, becoming a cry of anguish, A question screamed into a void. The room had gone completely, utterly still. Waiters stopped mid-stride. Trays held aloft. The low hum of conversation had evaporated. Every person in the room was now transfixed, their dinners forgotten, their wine glasses untouched. They were witnessing something impossible. The waitress, the invisible servile woman they hadn't given a second glance, was channeling a hurricane through her fingertips. The music was a story. It wasn't a known piece by Chopin or Rachmaninoff. It was something new, something raw and personal. It began with the quiet sorrow of loss, the hesitant notes of grief. Then it swelled into a torrent of rage. The chords became dissonant, crashing and powerful. Her hands flew across the keyboard in a blur of motion, a controlled chaos that was breathtaking to behold. It was the sound of slamming doors and shattered glass, of screaming matches, with God of the utter unbearable unfairness of a life stolen too soon. Caldwell was no longer confused. He was stunned. His jaw hung slightly agape, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. He had intended to humiliate her, to make her small. Instead, she was growing before his very eyes, filling the entire room with her power, making him feel small. The joke had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He was the fool. Across the room at a secluded corner table, an elderly man put down his fork with a quiet, deliberate clink. His name was Geneviève Dubois. With his shock of white hair and impeccably tailored suit, he was a legend in the world of classical music. A former conductor of the London Philharmonic, now the most feared and respected music critic for the New York Times, and most importantly, the chairman of the selection committee for the new National Symphony Hall. A word from Dubois could make or break a career, a symphony, a legacy. He had been dining alone, finding the food at the Gilded Lyre pedestrian, but the atmosphere tolerable. Now he was listening with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He didn't recognize the composition, which was in itself a shock. He knew everything. He catalogued concertos and sonatas in his mind, the way a botanist catalogues plants. This was uncharted territory. The structure, the harmonic language, the raw, unfiltered emotion. It was brilliant. It was the work of a master. He watched the waitress's hands. He saw the years of relentless practice in their effortless flight. He saw the Juilliard-level technique, the subtle shifts in weight and pressure that separated the good from the transcendent. But more than that, he heard a voice. An authentic, undeniable artistic voice, bleeding its pain and passion into the air. The music shifted again. The storm of rage subsided, giving way to a passage of aching beauty. It was the sound of memory, of a shared laugh, a whispered secret, a hand held in the dark. It was Leo's theme, the bright, soaring melody she had written for him when he was alive, now played with a heart-breaking tenderness. It was a memory so vivid, so full of love, that it felt like a ghost had entered the room. Hebe's eyes were closed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, baptizing the ivory keys. She was no longer in the Gilded Lyre. She was back in her small apartment 4 years ago, with Leo beside her, his head against the piano. She was playing for an audience of one. She poured every ounce of her being into that section. The love, the loss, the guilt of having survived, the promise she had broken. It was all there, a confession, an absolution, a farewell. The final section began. It was not a return to the initial sorrow nor the rage. It was something new, a quiet strength, a sense of peace hard-won from the battlefield of grief. The notes were clear, deliberate, and resolute. It was the sound of acceptance. The melody climbed one last time, not with the desperate anguish of before, but with a serene, soaring grace. It was the flight of a soul finally set free. She held the final chord, letting it resonate, filling the vast, silent space. It was a chord of hope, of finality, of a future unwritten. Then slowly she let it fade away, until the only sound in the entire restaurant was the soft, collective intake of breath from 200 stunned onlookers. The silence that followed was more profound than any applause. It was a vacuum, a sacred space carved out by the sheer force of her art. No one moved. No one spoke. They were suspended in the aftershock of her performance. Dermot Caldwell sat frozen, his face a pale, slack-jawed caricature of his earlier arrogance. The woman with the phone held it limply in her lap, her screen dark. Every trace of mockery had been sandblasted from the room, replaced by a raw, humbling awe. Hebe kept her head bowed for a long moment, her tears dripping onto her folded hands. The last note had been an exorcism. 4 years of pent-up grief, of silenced dreams, of suffocating duty had been poured out into that piano. She felt empty. And for the first time in a very long time, she also felt free. Slowly she lifted her head, her gaze sweeping across the sea of stunned faces, finally landing on Dermot Caldwell III. There was no anger left in her eyes, no hatred, only a quiet, devastating pity. The spell was broken by a single sharp sound. Clap. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a gunshot. Genevieve Dubois was on his feet. His expression was one of intense, unadulterated admiration. He began to applaud his movements, slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. Clap, clap, clap. It was a signal, a release. One by one, then, in a flood, the other diners rose to their feet. The room erupted. It wasn't polite, restaurant-level applause. It was a roar, a thunderous, heartfelt, standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. People were cheering, some were crying. Ben, her co-worker, was pumping his fist in the air, tears in his eyes. Mr. Henderson stood by the kitchen door, his face a portrait of utter astonishment and pride. Hebe had silenced the room with her music. Now they were giving her the voice back 100 times over. But through the thunder of applause, her eyes and the eyes of Genevieve Dubois were locked on only one man. Dermot Caldwell III, the billionaire, the puppet master. He was still sitting forgotten at his table, a ghost in his own theatre, as the waitress he tried to break received an ovation worthy of Carnegie Hall. The joke was over, and he was the punchline. The final chord, a resolution of both profound sorrow and nascent hope, hung in the air of the gilded lyre. It stretched, thinned, and finally dissolved, leaving behind a silence more absolute and commanding than any sound. The entire room was frozen in its wake. Forks hovered midway to mouths. Conversations that had been interrupted were forgotten entirely, and the faint clinking of the kitchen was gone, as if even the chefs had been stilled. 200 of New York's most powerful and jaded souls sat in a collective trance, their breath held captive. Hebe kept her head, bowed her own breath, coming in ragged, quiet gasps. The performance had hollowed her out, siphoning 4 years of compacted grief, rage, and shame out through her fingertips. She felt emptied, scoured clean. The adrenaline that had fueled her fury was draining away, leaving a strange, trembling peace. In the ringing silence, she could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart, a rhythm returning to a body that had just survived a storm. She had played for Leo. She had given him his flight. And now, for the first time, she felt the crushing weight lift from her shoulders. The spell was broken by a single, deliberate sound. Clap. It was not loud, but it cut through the thick silence with the precision of a scalpel. Across the room, Geneviève Dubois was rising from his seat. He was a man who commanded attention without demanding it, his posture erect, his shock of white hair a beacon in the dimly lit room. He brought his hands together again, his applause not rapid or fawning, but slow, rhythmic, and resonant with authority. Clap, clap, clap. It was not mere approval, it was a verdict. It was the signal that gave everyone else permission to feel. A woman in a nearby booth, her mascara smudged, was the first to join him, her claps quick and emotional. Then her husband rose, and the couple next to them. It started as a ripple, and then in a heartbeat, it became a tidal wave. The room erupted. People surged to their feet, their chairs scraping against the marble floor. The sound was a deafening, cathartic roar, a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the restaurant. There were cries of "Brava," sharp whistles of admiration, and the undisguised sounds of people weeping. Ben, her co-worker, stood near the service station, tears streaming down his face as he applauded his hands. Red. Mr. Henderson leaned against the kitchen doorframe, his professional mask shattered his face, a portrait of stunned, unadulterated pride. Even Caldwell's own guests, the sycophants and flatterers, were standing their expressions a mixture of confusion and genuine awe, their allegiance momentarily forgotten in the face of something so real. Hebe slowly lifted her head, blinking against the sudden onslaught of sound and motion. She saw the sea of faces, no longer looking at her with pity or amusement, but with a raw, humbling reverence. It was disorienting, overwhelming. This sound, this feeling, it was a ghost from a life she had believed was buried forever. As the applause began to slowly ebb, the crowd parted, creating a natural aisle. Geneviève Dubois began to walk toward the piano. His steps were unhurried, his focus singular. He moved through the throng of New York's elite as if they were merely scenery, his eyes alight with a brilliant analytical fire, never leaving Hebe. He completely bypassed the table where a dumbstruck Dermot Caldwell sat, making the billionaire seem not just irrelevant, but invisible. Dubois stopped before the magnificent Fazioli, regarding Hebe not as a waitress, not as a spectacle, but as a peer. "Mademoiselle," he began, his voice, a low, resonant baritone that carried a lifetime of listening to the world's greatest music. "I have been a critic for 45 years. I have heard Horowitz in his prime. I have witnessed Paulini's fire. I have reviewed thousands of performances in every great hall on this earth. But I have never," he paused, his gaze intensifying, "in all my life heard a debut performance of such staggering emotional honesty and technical brilliance." Hebe felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a stark contrast to the cold dread she'd felt just minutes before. "Thank you, sir," she whispered the words, feeling inadequate. "That composition," he continued with a gesture toward the keys, "it has the harmonic complexity of Ravel and the raw fury of early Scriabin, yet the voice is one I have never encountered. It is entirely new. It is not in any catalogue. Tell me who is the composer." This was the moment. The entire room, now hushed again, leaned in to listen. She could have been demure. She could have deflected. But the music had been a confession, and she could not follow it with a lie. She took a breath, her gaze lifting past Dubois to sweep over the room, finally landing, with a quiet and devastating finality, on Dermot Caldwell. "I am," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. "I wrote it." A new shockwave of whispers of disbelief and astonishment coursed through the restaurant. The performance was a miracle. The revelation was a legend in the making. Dubois' eyebrows shot up, and then a slow, magnificent smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a prospector, who had just struck the mother lode. "Of course you did," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It could have been written by no one else. It was too personal, too true. What is its name?" She thought of Leo, small and quick and full of a life too big for his body. "It's called Requiem for a Sparrow." "A requiem," Dubois mused, nodding slowly, his eyes seeing something far beyond the room. How perfect, for it is the story of both a death and a glorious resurrection. It was at this precise moment that Dermot Caldwell, jolted from his stupor by the unbearable weight of his own irrelevance, decided to claw his way back to the center of the stage. He shoved his chair back with a loud scrape and strode toward the piano, manufacturing a booming laugh that sounded brittle and hollow. "Well, well, what did I tell you all?" he bellowed, forcing a convivial tone that fooled no one. He clapped Hebe firmly on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership of a master claiming his property. "A hidden talent, I have an ear for these things, you know. Knew she had it in her. Just needed a little encouragement. A patron's touch." He was desperately trying to reframe the narrative, to cast himself not as the cruel tormentor, but as the brilliant, benevolent producer who had discovered this raw talent. He pulled out his thick money clip, the gesture now appearing cartoonishly vulgar. He peeled off a thick wad of $100 bills, fanning them out like a cheap magician. "Here, my dear," he said, pushing the money toward her. "A proper bonus for a fantastic performance. Let's call it $5,000 for services rendered." The offer was an obscenity. It was a desperate, ham-fisted attempt to drag her masterpiece down to his level, to reduce her art to a transaction, to re-establish the brutal power dynamic of billionaire and servant. He wasn't praising her. He was trying to buy her, to own her story, to silence the truth of what he had done. The room, which had been buzzing with admiration, went ice-cold. Hebe looked at the money in his hand. Then she looked up into his smug, desperate face, and she did something that sealed his fate. She smiled. It was not a smile of gratitude or fear. It was a small, sharp, knowing smile forged in the fire of her performance. It was the smile of someone who had faced down her deepest grief and found that a bully like him was nothing by comparison. "No, thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a newly struck bell. "I'm not for sale." She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The quiet statement of dignity was more powerful than any scream. With a steady hand, she gently but firmly pushed his hand and his money away from her. Caldwell's face cycled through disbelief, then fury. His public offer had been publicly, humiliatingly rejected. "Don't be a fool, girl," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "Take the money. It's more than you'll make in a year of slinging hash in this place." Before Hebe could even think of a response, Dubois moved. He stepped smoothly between them, a calm, immovable object, placing himself as a shield in front of Hebe. He looked at Caldwell, his expression having shifted from admiration for Hebe to a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Mr. Caldwell," Dubois said, his tone glacial, "you are a man of buildings and balance sheets. You understand price, but you have demonstrated tonight with a staggering lack of grace that you have absolutely no concept of value." Caldwell, incensed, scoffed. "And who are you to lecture me? Some dusty old music professor." It was his final fatal error. A dangerous light glinted in Dubois' eyes. "Among other things," he replied coolly, "I am Genevieve Dubois, and I am the chairman of the board for the new National Symphony Hall project." The name followed by the title landed with the force of a physical blow. The air was sucked out of the room. Even Caldwell, cocooned in his world of corporate dominance, knew that name and the weight it carried. The National Symphony Hall was the city's crown jewel, a $500 million monument to culture, and Caldwell's company was the lead bidder for its naming rights. The color drained from Caldwell's face as the pieces clicked into place with sickening speed. Your company, Caldwell Enterprises. Dubois continued, his voice a weapon of surgical precision, has been courting my board for 6 months. You wish to christen it the Caldwell Center for the Performing Arts. Your proposal speaks of a deep and abiding commitment to the cultural fabric of our great city. Dubois paused, letting the hypocrisy hang in the air. He then gestured to Hebe, who stood watching her heart hammering against her ribs. Tonight I have seen your commitment to the arts firsthand. You treat artists as your personal jesters. You use your power to humiliate and demean for sport. You believe your wealth gives you the right to command a person's soul for your own fleeting amusement. You, sir, are the very definition of a barbarian at the gate. You are the antithesis of everything that Hall is meant to represent. Caldwell stammered, his bravado utterly shattered. Now hold on, this is a misunderstanding. It was a joke that went too far. It was not a joke. Dubois cut him off, his voice sharp and final. It was a public display of character, and I and the rest of the board will be taking this display into full and immediate consideration. You want your name on our Temple of Music. I would sooner see it named after a pile of rubble. As of this moment, Mr. Caldwell, consider your proposal and your 9-figure pledge officially and permanently rejected. You will receive the formal notification in the morning. It was a public execution. His legacy, the project that was to launder his ruthless reputation and cement the Caldwell name for a century, had just been vaporized in front of 200 of New York's most influential people. He stood there exposed and neutered, his money and power rendered utterly useless. He stared at Dubois, then at Hebe. His face was a contorted mask of pure rage and abject humiliation. Dermot Caldwell III had been brought down, not by a corporate takeover, but by a waitress and a song. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled noise came out. There was nothing to say. He turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit, a defeated king fleeing his own failed coup. His entourage, after a moment of stunned paralysis, scrambled to follow him, their night of reflected glory ending in shared disgrace. In the ensuing silence, Dubois turned back to Hebe, his expression softening once more. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice now gentle, "you have a rare and precious gift. Do not let anyone ever again make you feel it is anything less." Hebe nodded, a single tear of relief and release rolling down her cheek. She then turned to Mr. Henderson, who was looking at her as if she had just sprouted wings. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear and firm, "I quit." She didn't say it with anger. It was a simple statement of fact. Her life as a ghost was over. With a slow, deliberate grace, she untied the stained white apron from around her waist. She folded it neatly, a final act of a job she no longer needed. She turned to the Fazioli and placed the folded apron on the corner of its gleaming black surface, an offering to the instrument that had become her liberator. Then, with her back straight and her head held high, she walked away from the piano, past the stunned, admiring faces of the diners and straight toward the restaurant's grand entrance. She didn't look back. She was walking out of the Gilded Lyre, out of the servitude and the silence, and into the cool, promising air of the New York night, which now felt for the first time in years like it belonged to her. The aftermath of that night at the Gilded Lyre was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. The story escaped the velvet-draped walls before Dermot Caldwell's car had even reached the FDR Drive. It traveled through whispers between tables, then blossomed in the blue light of smartphones in a flurry of texts. You will not believe what just happened at the Lyre. Caldwell, a waitress, the piano. It was a modern fable too perfect to be fiction, and it spread through the city's elite with the speed of a stock market crash. By the next morning, Beatrice Adler, a society columnist for a major city paper who had been dining alone 2 tables away, published her weekly column. It was a masterpiece of elegant assassination. Without naming a single person, she painted a vivid picture of an evening of profound art and profound arrogance. She described the chilling spectacle of a corporate titan attempting to purchase a woman's dignity for sport, and the miraculous, soul-bearing music that followed. She concluded with a devastating line: "It seems the city's temples of culture are safe for now from the barbarians whose gold is far shinier than their character." The column was forwarded to every corner of finance, art, and media in New York. Everyone knew who the barbarian was. For Dermot Caldwell III, the fallout was apocalyptic. Genevieve Dubois, a man of his word, had already set the wheels in motion. The official rejection of Caldwell Enterprises' bid for the Symphony Hall naming rights was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal's digital edition by 9 a.m. The story wasn't just about a rescinded offer. It framed Caldwell as a corporate liability, a man whose character was so fundamentally flawed it made him toxic. His morning was a blur of panicked calls. His PR team was in full meltdown, unable to spin a story where their client was so clearly the villain. His board of directors, already uneasy with his impulsive leadership, convened an emergency meeting. The joke was no longer a personal failing. It was a multi-million-dollar branding catastrophe that had made the company a laughingstock. But the most damning call came from his father, Dermot Caldwell II, a man who had built the empire on a foundation of ruthless but impeccable strategy. The old man's voice was not loud, but low and cold, with a fury that was far more terrifying. "You have made the family name into a punchline," he'd said before hanging up. Dermot Caldwell III sat alone in his sterile Park Avenue office, the city glittering below him. He had lost the deal, he had lost the respect of his board, and he had lost the approval of his father. But worse than that, he had lost the one thing he truly valued, the fear he commanded. He had been brought down not by a rival or a market turn, but by a waitress, a pianist, a nobody. His empire of arrogance had been toppled by a song. For Hebe, the world had been remade. The subway ride back to the Bronx was a surreal journey through a dreamscape. She felt disconnected from her own body, watching herself move through the familiar grime and rattle of the 2 train. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed different. The faces of the other tired commuters no longer just a backdrop to her own exhaustion, but a sea of stories she suddenly felt connected to. She stepped out into the familiar air of her neighborhood, a world away from the suffocating perfume of the gilded lyre, and felt a single clean emotion cut through the day's relief. She found her mother asleep in her armchair, the television murmuring softly. Hebe stood in the living room doorway, looking at the shrouded form in the corner. The white sheet over the upright piano had always looked like a burial shroud to her, a monument to her failure to Leo's memory, frozen in time. Tonight it looked different. It wasn't a tombstone. It was a veil, and she was finally ready to lift it. She slept for 12 straight hours, a deep, dreamless plunge into a silence she hadn't known since childhood. It was a sleep free from the gnawing anxiety of rent, of condescending patrons, of a future that felt like a narrowing hallway. She woke to the Sunday morning sun slanting through her window, and the smell of coffee. Her mother was humming in the kitchen, a cheerful sound Hebe hadn't heard in years. Her phone lay on the nightstand, a small black rectangle of dread and possibility. She picked it up. 37 missed calls, dozens of texts. She scrolled through them, her heart thumping. There were frantic, joyous messages from Ben. "Hey boo, you are a rock goddess, call me." There were 2 formal apologetic calls from Mr. Henderson offering her job back, a promotion to floor manager, anything she wanted. There were numbers she didn't recognize, which she correctly assumed were reporters. Then she saw it. A single voicemail from a restricted number. Her finger hovered over the play button, her breath catching in her throat. She pressed it. A woman's voice, professional and calm, filled the quiet of her room. "Miss Washington, this is Eleanor Vance from the office of Mr. Genevieve Dubois. Mr. Dubois was exceptionally moved by your performance last night. He believes your talent is of significant cultural importance. He would like to arrange a meeting with you at your earliest convenience to discuss your future." The voice paused, then continued. "Please call me back at this number." Your future. The 2 words echoed in her mind. A future. It was a country she had long since been exiled from. She listened to the message 3 more times, the woman's calm voice, a lifeline, pulling her from the wreckage of her past life. 2 days later, she stood before a pre-war building on the Upper West Side, a grand stone edifice that exuded quiet old-world power. Dressed in the nicest clothes she owned, she felt a flicker of the old imposter syndrome, the waitress ghost, trying to walk in the daylight. But as she entered the lobby, a new feeling took its place, a sense of homecoming. Dubois' office was on the top floor, a sun-drenched sanctuary, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It smelled of old paper lemon polish and brewing tea. Signed scores from Copland and Bernstein were framed on the walls, and on a stand near the window sat a conductor's baton, worn smooth with use. Dubois greeted her not with pity or patronizing praise, but with the warm, respectful welcome of one artist to another. "Requiem for a Sparrow," he said, after they had sat down with cups of tea, his gaze direct and intense. "I have not stopped thinking about it. The transition from the A-minor rage into that heartbreakingly pure C-major theme of remembrance. It was structurally brilliant. But more than that, it was true. Have you written other pieces?" Hebe hesitantly at first, then with a gathering momentum, Hebe told him everything. She spoke of Juilliard, the pressure, the joy. She spoke of Leo, her voice cracking as she described his laughter and his unwavering belief in her. She confessed her guilt, the silence, the promise she'd made to herself in the depths of her grief. She spoke of the compositions packed away in a box under her bed, an archive of a dead girl's dreams. Dubois listened without interruption, his expression one of profound empathy. When she finished a tear tracing a path down her cheek, he didn't offer platitudes. "Grief can be a prison," he said softly. "It locks us in the past and convinces us there is no door to the future. But for an artist, Hebe, it can also be the ink with which we write our greatest truths. You did not abandon music. You were simply gathering the story you needed to tell." He leaned forward, his eyes alight with purpose. "I am on the board of the Devereux Foundation. It is our mission to find and support singular artistic voices. And yours, Hebe, is the most singular I have heard in a decade." He then laid out an offer so audacious, so impossible it felt like a hallucination. He wanted to award her the Foundation's most prestigious fellowship. It included a living stipend, generous enough to support her and her mother for 2 years, freeing her entirely from financial worry. It included a separate grant to purchase a new concert grand piano, of her choosing a Steinway, a Fazioli, whatever she desired, And then came the final heart-stopping piece, a formal commission. "We want you to expand Requiem for a Sparrow," he said, his voice resonating with excitement. "We want you to orchestrate it, to turn it into a full piano concerto. The New York Philharmonic has already agreed in principle to premiere it at the opening of their season next year." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. At the National Symphony Hall, the very hall that bore the ghost of Caldwell's ambition. The irony was so potent, so perfectly poetic, that Hebe could only let out a shaky half-laugh, half-sob. This wasn't just an offer, it was a changing of the guard. It was justice set to music. Tears were streaming down her face, now washing away 4 years of pain and regret. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Dubois said gently. "There is one condition, however." Hebe looked up, ready to agree to anything. "What is it you must promise me?" He said, his expression serious and kind, "that you will never be silent again." That evening, Hebe returned home. She walked directly to the shrouded piano in her living room, her mother watching from the doorway, with a knowing, tearful smile. With a single decisive motion, Hebe grasped the edge of the dusty sheet and pulled. It came away in a cloud of dust motes dancing in the evening light. The old upright piano with its yellowed keys and scarred wood stood revealed. It wasn't a world-class instrument, but it was hers. It was her history. She sat down on the familiar bench, the worn velvet a comforting presence. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling not the cold accusation of a tombstone, but the warm, familiar welcome of an old friend. She took a breath, not of expensive, judgmental air, but of the love-filled air of her own home. And she began to play. It was not a requiem. It was a prelude, a simple melody that began as a question, full of the quiet hope and lingering uncertainty of a new dawn before resolving into a series of powerful, confident chords. It was the sound of a promise being kept. It was the symphony of a new beginning. What began as a casual act of cruelty, a billionaire's attempt to weaponize shame for his own amusement, ultimately became a legend whispered through the heart of the city. The story of that night at the Gilded Lyre is far more than a tale of a hidden talent revealed. It is a powerful parable about the true nature of power. Dermot Caldwell believed his power lived in his bank accounts, his corporate influence, and the fear he could instill. But his was a hollow empire, a fortress made of glass, and it shattered at the sound of a truth it could not silence. Hebe Washington's power, buried under years of grief and duty, was of a different kind entirely. It was the intrinsic, indestructible power of integrity, resilience, and authentic genius. Her performance was not just a beautiful piece of music, it was a reckoning. In those few minutes, her song stripped away the superficial labels of Billionaire and Waitress, exposing the far more fundamental identities of bully and artist. The piano became the great equalizer, an instrument that cared nothing for social status and everything for the honesty of the soul. Her music didn't just fill the room with sound, it recalibrated its moral compass, reminding everyone present that dignity can never be purchased, and true value can never be intimidated. Hebe's journey serves as a profound and inspiring testament to the countless hidden geniuses who walk among us, the artists, thinkers, and leaders disguised as baristas, clerks, and servers. Her story challenges us to look beyond the uniforms and job titles, to recognize the potential for greatness that resides in the quiet corners of our world. It is a stirring reminder that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, doesn't always break. Sometimes it awakens, emerging with a strength and beauty that can topple tyrants and compose a new, more hopeful reality from the ashes of despair. If this incredible story of resilience, justice, and the transcendent power of art resonated deep within you, please honor Hibe's journey by giving this video a like and sharing it with anyone who needs a reminder that their own voice has value. For more true stories that uncover the extraordinary strength hidden in ordinary life, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Thank you for watching and for being a part of our community.